Welcome, friends. Tonight, let's take a soft and soothing journey together into the curious and mysterious workings of the human mind. Every day, without realizing it, your brain plays subtle tricks, shaping your thoughts, your emotions, even your choices. From the comfort of hearing a familiar song to the way small details capture your attention, these hidden effects surround us constantly. As you settle in, breathe gently and let yourself sink into the quiet rhythm of your own body. Picture your thoughts drifting by like clouds, fading into the distance. With each breath, you'll feel closer to calm, closer to rest. And if this video brings you peace tonight, it would mean a lot if you could help us reach a simple goal. 200 likes. A gentle tap. No pressure. Just a way to share this atmosphere with others who need it. Shall we begin? The Dunning-Kruger effect. Picture this scenario. You've just learned how to drive a car for the first time. After a few successful trips around the neighborhood, you suddenly feel like you could handle Formula One racing. Or maybe you've watched a couple of cooking videos on YouTube, and now you're convinced you could run a 5-star restaurant. This overconfidence in your limited abilities is exactly what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect. Named after David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who first studied this phenomenon in 1999, this cognitive bias describes how people with low ability in a particular area tend to overestimate their competence. The irony is striking. The less someone knows about a subject, the more confident they often become about their expertise in that very area. The effect works like this. When you first start learning something new, you gain a little bit of knowledge quickly. This initial learning gives you a false sense of mastery because you don't yet understand how much you don't know. You're essentially too inexperienced to recognize your own inexperience. It's like standing at the base of a mountain and thinking you can see the summit, only to discover, after climbing for hours, that you were just looking at the first ridge. The original research demonstrated this beautifully. Dunning and Kruger tested people on various skills, like grammar, logic, and humor. Those who performed in the bottom quarter consistently rated their abilities as above average. They weren't just slightly off in their self-assessment either. Some participants who scored in the 12th percentile estimated their performance to be in the 62nd percentile. That's not a small miscalculation. That's a complete disconnect from reality. But here's where it gets interesting. The effect doesn't just make incompetent people overconfident. It also prevents them from recognizing genuine competence in others. If you don't understand what true expertise looks like, you can't identify it when you see it. This creates a double burden. Not only do these individuals overestimate their own abilities, but they also fail to learn from people who actually know what they're doing. The internet age has amplified this effect dramatically. Social media platforms are filled with armchair experts who've read a few articles and now feel qualified to debate specialists who've spent decades studying their fields. Climate science, medicine, economics, you name it. Complex subjects that require years of study are being confidently discussed by people with minimal understanding. However, there's hope in understanding this effect. As people gain more genuine knowledge and experience, they typically become more aware of their limitations. True experts often display appropriate humility because they understand the complexity and nuances of their field. They know what they don't know, and they respect the boundaries of their expertise. The key to avoiding the Dunning-Kruger trap is developing what psychologists call metacognition, basically thinking about your thinking. Before forming strong opinions or making confident claims, pause and honestly assess your knowledge level. Ask yourself how much you really understand about the topic. Consider seeking out opposing viewpoints and expert opinions. Most importantly, embrace the phrase, "I don't know," as a starting point for learning, rather than something to be ashamed of. Remember, confidence without competence isn't strength. It's a liability that prevents real growth and understanding. The spotlight effect. Imagine you're walking down a busy street when suddenly you trip and stumble forward, catching yourself just before falling. In that moment, you feel like everyone around you witnessed your embarrassing moment. Your cheeks burn with shame as you imagine dozens of eyes focused on your clumsy display. But here's the fascinating truth. Most people probably didn't even notice. This overwhelming feeling that others are watching and judging our every move is what psychologists call the spotlight effect. The spotlight effect describes our tendency to overestimate how much attention others pay to our behavior, appearance, and mistakes. We essentially believe there's an invisible spotlight following us around, illuminating our every action for the world to see and judge. In reality, most people are far too busy dealing with their own lives, concerns, and thoughts to focus extensively on what we're doing. This psychological phenomenon stems from what researchers call egocentrism, but not in the selfish sense you might think. It's simply that we experience the world from our own perspective, making it difficult to accurately gauge how others perceive us. Since we're constantly aware of our own thoughts, feelings, and actions, we naturally assume others are equally aware of and focused on them. The effect was first formally studied by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky in the late 1990s. In one of their clever experiments, they asked college students to wear embarrassing t-shirts with large pictures of singer Barry Manilow to a room full of other students. The t-shirt wearers estimated that about half the people in the room noticed their embarrassing shirt. In reality, only about 25% actually noticed. The spotlight they felt shining on them was twice as bright as it actually was. Another study involved participants making mistakes during group activities. Those who made errors consistently overestimated how much their mistakes stood out to others. They thought their blunders were glaringly obvious and memorable, when in fact, other group members barely registered these slip-ups or quickly forgot about them. The spotlight effect affects various aspects of our daily lives. Think about how you feel when you have a bad hair day, wear an outfit you're not confident about, or say something slightly awkward in conversation. You might spend hours replaying these moments, convinced that others noticed and are judging you harshly. Meanwhile, those same people are probably worried about their own appearance or replay their own awkward moments. Social media has intensified this effect significantly. When we post photos or updates, we often anxiously check for likes, comments, and reactions, assuming everyone is scrutinizing our posts with the same intensity we use to examine them. We forget that others scroll through hundreds of posts daily, giving each one only seconds of attention before moving on to the next. Understanding the spotlight effect can be incredibly liberating. It reminds us that most people are not paying nearly as much attention to our flaws and mistakes as we imagine. That pimple you're obsessing over? Most people won't notice it. That slightly wrong answer you gave in a meeting? Your colleagues probably forgot about it within minutes. This doesn't mean people never notice anything about us, but rather that their attention is much more fleeting and less judgmental than we typically assume. People are generally more concerned with how they appear to others than with closely examining our every move. The next time you feel that imaginary spotlight burning down on you, remember this: everyone else is dealing with their own spotlight anxieties. They're too busy worrying about their own performance to spend much time analyzing yours. This realization can help reduce social anxiety and allow you to move through the world with greater confidence and authenticity. FOMO, fear of missing out. You're having a quiet evening at home, reading a book and enjoying some tea, when suddenly your phone buzzes with notifications. Your friends are posting photos from a party you weren't invited to. Another friend shares pictures from an exotic vacation. Someone else announces their promotion at work. Within minutes, your peaceful contentment transforms into a gnawing anxiety that you're missing out on something important. This uncomfortable feeling has a name: FOMO, or fear of missing out. FOMO represents a pervasive apprehension that others might be having more rewarding experiences than you are. It's the nagging worry that somewhere else, something better is happening without you. This psychological phenomenon isn't entirely new. Humans have always compared themselves to others, but social media has amplified it to unprecedented levels. The term FOMO was popularized by marketing strategist Dan Herman in 2000. Though the concept existed long before social platforms made it a household phrase. What makes modern FOMO particularly intense is the constant stream of curated highlight reels that social media provides. We see carefully selected snapshots of other people's best moments, comparing them to our ordinary, unfiltered daily experiences. At its core, FOMO stems from several psychological factors. First, there's social comparison theory, which suggests we evaluate ourselves relative to others to gauge our own worth and success. When we see others seemingly having more fun, achieving more success, or experiencing more excitement, we naturally question our own choices and circumstances. FOMO also connects to our fundamental need for social connection and belonging. Humans are inherently social creatures, and the fear of being left out taps into deep-seated anxieties about social rejection and isolation. When we see groups of friends together without us, it triggers primal concerns about our social status and acceptance. The psychology behind FOMO involves what researchers call anticipated regret. We imagine how much we might regret not participating in an experience, and this anticipated regret drives us to say yes to invitations, purchase products, or make decisions we might not otherwise make. This fear of future regret can be more powerful than the actual experience itself. Social media platforms have essentially weaponized FOMO for profit. Features like Instagram stories, Snapchat streaks, and Facebook event notifications are designed to keep us constantly engaged and worried about what we might miss if we log off. The endless scroll of content ensures there's always something new to discover, making it difficult to feel satisfied with what we've already seen. FOMO manifests in various ways throughout our lives. It might drive you to attend social events you don't actually enjoy, just because you worry about missing out. It could push you to constantly check your phone during meaningful conversations, afraid that something more interesting is happening online. Some people experience FOMO about career opportunities, relationships, travel experiences, or even simple daily choices, like which restaurant to visit. The irony of FOMO is that it often prevents us from fully enjoying our current experiences. When we're constantly worried about what else might be happening, we struggle to be present and appreciate what's right in front of us. This creates a cycle where we're always looking elsewhere for satisfaction, never finding it because we're not truly engaged with our present moment. Research has shown that FOMO correlates with higher levels of anxiety, depression, and overall life dissatisfaction. People who frequently experience FOMO report feeling more tired, less satisfied with their lives, and more dependent on social media for validation and connection. However, understanding FOMO can help us combat its negative effects. The first step is recognizing that social media presents a distorted view of reality. Those vacation photos don't show the delayed flights, arguments, or boring moments. That career announcement doesn't reveal the stress, long hours, or workplace challenges behind it. Practicing gratitude and mindfulness can help counter FOMO's grip. Instead of focusing on what you're missing, try appreciating what you have. Engage fully with your current activities and relationships. Remember that saying no to one opportunity often means saying yes to something else that might be equally or more valuable. The illusion of control. Picture yourself at a casino, standing in front of a slot machine. You notice that someone just walked away after losing several rounds in a row. Surely, you think, this machine is due for a payout. You sit down and start playing, convinced that your timing, your technique of pulling the lever, or even the lucky shirt you're wearing, will somehow influence the completely random outcome. This belief that you can control or influence events that are actually determined by chance is known as the illusion of control. The illusion of control is a cognitive bias where people overestimate their ability to influence outcomes that are largely or entirely determined by chance. We tend to believe we have more power over situations than we actually do, especially when we're personally involved in the process or when the situation resembles something we can typically control. This fascinating psychological phenomenon was first identified and named by psychologist Ellen Langer in 1975. In her groundbreaking research, she conducted experiments involving lottery tickets. When people were allowed to choose their own lottery numbers, rather than being assigned random ones, they demanded significantly higher prices when asked to sell their tickets back. The simple act of choosing numbers that were still completely random made people feel they had somehow improved their odds of winning. Langer discovered that several factors increase our illusion of control. Choice is a major one. When we can select from options, even meaningless ones, we feel more in control. Familiarity also plays a role. If a random situation resembles something we're skilled at, like throwing dice resembling a game we know, we overestimate our influence. Personal involvement matters too. The more actively engaged we are in a process, the more control we think we have over its outcome. Competition further amplifies this illusion. When we're competing against others in chance-based activities, we often believe our skills or strategies can tip the odds in our favor. This is why poker players develop elaborate rituals and superstitions, why sports fans wear lucky jerseys, believing it helps their team win, or why some people blow on dice before rolling them. The illusion extends far beyond gambling and games. In financial markets, many investors believe they can predict stock movements and time the market perfectly, despite overwhelming evidence that even professional fund managers rarely beat random chance consistently. Day traders often fall victim to this bias, attributing wins to their skill while dismissing losses as bad luck or external factors. In our daily lives, we see this illusion everywhere. People choose their own lottery numbers instead of using quick picks, believing their selection method gives them better odds. Drivers think they can influence traffic light timing by approaching at certain speeds or positioning their cars in specific ways. Some individuals perform elaborate rituals before important events, convinced these actions will improve their chances of success. The illusion of control isn't entirely negative. It can boost confidence, motivation, and persistence in challenging situations. People who feel they have some control over their circumstances often experience less stress and anxiety. This perceived control can lead to more positive outcomes, not because we actually control random events, but because the belief itself influences our behavior and decision-making. However, this bias can also lead to problematic behaviors. Problem gambling often stems partly from an inflated sense of control over games of pure chance. People might make poor financial decisions, believing they can predict market movements or control investment outcomes. In extreme cases, the illusion can prevent people from seeking help or taking necessary precautions, because they believe they can handle situations that are actually beyond their influence. Understanding the illusion of control helps us make better decisions. By recognizing the difference between situations we can actually influence and those determined by chance. When facing truly random events, it's more productive to focus on factors we can control, like our preparation, attitude, and response to outcomes, rather than trying to influence the uncontrollable. The key is developing what psychologists call accurate perceived control, understanding what we can and cannot influence. This awareness allows us to direct our energy toward areas where our actions truly matter, while accepting that some aspects of life remain beautifully, frustratingly random. Cognitive dissonance. Imagine you consider yourself an environmentally conscious person. You recycle diligently, buy organic food, and lecture your friends about climate change. Yet every morning, you drive your gas-guzzling SUV to work instead of taking public transportation, telling yourself that you need the space and comfort for your daily commute. This uncomfortable tension between your environmental values and your actual behavior creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance occurs when we hold contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, or when our actions don't align with our stated beliefs. This mental conflict creates psychological discomfort, an unpleasant feeling that motivates us to reduce the inconsistency somehow. The term was coined by social psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957, and it remains one of the most influential theories in psychology. Festinger discovered this phenomenon while studying a doomsday cult that predicted the world would end on a specific date. When the predicted apocalypse didn't occur, instead of abandoning their beliefs, Many cult members actually strengthened their faith and began proselytizing more actively. They resolved their dissonance by deciding that their prayers had saved the world, allowing them to maintain their beliefs despite contradictory evidence. The discomfort of cognitive dissonance stems from our fundamental need for consistency and coherence in our mental lives. Humans are naturally motivated to see themselves as rational, consistent beings. When we encounter information or engage in behaviors that contradict our existing beliefs or self-image, our brains essentially sound an alarm, creating psychological tension that demands resolution. There are several ways people typically resolve cognitive dissonance. The first is changing one of the conflicting beliefs or attitudes. If you believe smoking is harmful, but continue smoking, you might quit smoking to align your behavior with your health beliefs. However, this approach often requires the most effort and significant life changes, so many people choose easier paths. A more common resolution involves changing the importance of the conflicting elements. You might decide that the pleasure you get from smoking outweighs the health risks, or that the health studies aren't as conclusive as previously thought. This allows you to continue smoking while reducing the psychological discomfort. People also resolve dissonance by adding new beliefs that justify the contradiction. A smoker might adopt the belief that life is short anyway, that everyone dies of something eventually, or that their genetics are more important than their lifestyle choices. These additional beliefs serve as psychological bridges that reduce the tension between conflicting ideas. Selective exposure is another powerful dissonance reduction strategy. People actively seek information that confirms their existing beliefs while avoiding contradictory evidence. In our politically polarized world, this manifests as people choosing news sources that reinforce their worldviews and dismissing opposing perspectives as biased or fake. Cognitive dissonance plays a significant role in many aspects of human behavior. It helps explain why people often become more committed to decisions after making them, even when those decisions prove problematic. Once we've invested time, money, or effort into something, admitting we were wrong creates dissonance, so we often double down instead of changing course. This phenomenon is particularly relevant in consumer behavior. After making expensive purchases, buyers often experience post-purchase dissonance, questioning whether they made the right choice. To reduce this discomfort, they seek positive reviews of their purchase while avoiding negative ones, or they focus on the product's benefits while downplaying its drawbacks. In relationships, cognitive dissonance can keep people in unhealthy situations. When someone's partner treats them poorly, but they believe they're in a loving relationship, they might minimize the bad behavior, blame themselves, or focus exclusively on rare positive moments to maintain their belief in the relationship's value. Understanding cognitive dissonance can help us make better decisions and develop more accurate self-awareness. When you notice yourself rationalizing contradictory behaviors or beliefs, pause and examine the situation honestly. Ask yourself whether you're genuinely changing your mind based on new evidence or simply trying to reduce psychological discomfort. The goal isn't to eliminate all inconsistency, which is impossible in complex human lives, but to recognize when dissonance might be preventing you from seeing situations clearly or making necessary changes. The sunk cost fallacy. You've been sitting in a terrible movie for an hour and 15 minutes. The plot makes no sense. The acting is atrocious, and you're genuinely bored out of your mind. But instead of leaving the theater, you stay glued to your seat, thinking, I've already paid for the ticket and invested this much time. I might as well see how it ends. This reluctance to abandon a course of action because of previously invested resources, time, money, or effort is what economists and psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy occurs when we continue investing in a losing proposition based on previously invested resources, rather than evaluating the situation based on future costs and benefits. Essentially, we throw good money after bad, good time after wasted time, or good energy after squandered effort, because we can't bear to waste what we've already put in. The term sunk cost comes from economics and refers to costs that have already been incurred and cannot be recovered. In rational decision-making, these past investments should be irrelevant to future choices. What matters is whether continuing forward will provide more benefit than cost from this point onward. However, human psychology doesn't always align with economic rationality. This fallacy manifests everywhere in our daily lives. Consider the person who continues eating a meal they're not enjoying simply because they paid for it, or the individual who stays in an unfulfilling job for years because they've already invested so much time building their career there. Perhaps you know someone who keeps repairing an old car that breaks down constantly, spending thousands of dollars because they've already put so much money into it. The psychology behind this fallacy involves several cognitive and emotional factors. Loss aversion plays a significant role. We hate losing things more than we enjoy gaining them. When we abandon something we've invested in, it feels like a concrete loss, even if continuing would lead to even greater losses. Our brains are wired to avoid crystallizing losses whenever possible. Pride and ego also contribute significantly to this fallacy. Admitting that our previous decisions were wrong, or that our investments were mistakes, can be psychologically painful. It challenges our self-image as competent decision-makers. So instead of acknowledging an error, we often double down, hoping to vindicate our original choice and preserve our sense of competence. Commitment escalation is another psychological factor at work. Once we publicly commit to a course of action, especially if others are watching, we feel pressure to follow through. The more we've invested, the more committed we feel, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. The sunk cost fallacy appears dramatically in business contexts. Companies continue funding failing projects because they've already invested millions in development. Managers keep underperforming employees because of the time and resources spent on training them. Entrepreneurs persist with business models that clearly aren't working because of the years they've devoted to building their companies. In relationships, this fallacy can keep people in unhealthy partnerships far longer than they should stay. They think about the years they've invested, the memories they've created, the shared experiences, and mutual friends. The thought of wasting all that history by ending the relationship can prevent them from making necessary changes for their well-being. Educational decisions also fall prey to this fallacy. Students continue pursuing degrees they've lost interest in because they've already completed several years of coursework. They fear that changing majors or dropping out would waste their previous efforts, even though switching paths might lead to better outcomes. The key to overcoming the sunk cost fallacy lies in shifting focus from past investments to future possibilities. Before making any continuation decision, ask yourself, if I were starting fresh today, knowing what I know now, would I begin this course of action? If the answer is no, then your past investments shouldn't change that conclusion. Learn to reframe past investments, not as wasted resources, but as valuable learning experiences that inform better future decisions. Every failed project, ended relationship, or abandoned pursuit teaches you something about your preferences, capabilities, and goals. The mere exposure effect. Remember the first time you heard that song that's now your favorite? Chances are you didn't love it immediately. Maybe you found it strange, unremarkable, or even slightly annoying. But after hearing it several times on the radio, in stores, or on a friend's playlist, something shifted. You started humming along, then actively seeking it out, until eventually it became a song you genuinely loved. This phenomenon, where repeated exposure to something makes us like it more, is called the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect, also known as the familiarity principle, describes our tendency to develop a preference for things simply because we're familiar with them. The more we encounter something, whether it's a person, an object, a sound, or even an idea, the more we tend to like it, even when we're not consciously aware of the repeated exposures. This psychological phenomenon was extensively studied by social psychologist Robert Zeigarnik in the 1960s. In one of his famous experiments, Zeigarnik showed participants nonsense words and Chinese characters at varying frequencies, even though the symbols had no inherent meaning to the participants. They consistently rated the ones they'd seen more frequently as more pleasant and positive. The effect occurred even when exposures were had brief that participants couldn't consciously remember seeing the stimuli. The effect works across remarkably diverse contexts. It influences our musical tastes, which is why radio stations can turn unknown songs into hits through constant repetition. It affects our food preferences, explaining why we often grow to love foods we initially disliked after trying them multiple times. It even impacts our social relationships, with studies showing that people who sit near each other in classrooms or work environments tend to become friends simply due to proximity and repeated interactions. Several theories attempt to explain why mere exposure creates preference. One prominent explanation is the perceptual fluency theory, which suggests that repeated exposure makes things easier for our brains to process. This cognitive ease creates a positive feeling that we then attribute to the stimulus itself. Our brains essentially interpret the smooth processing as a signal that the thing is good or safe. From an evolutionary perspective, the effect makes sense. Things we encounter repeatedly without negative consequences are likely safe and non-threatening. In ancestral environments, unfamiliar things posed potential dangers, so developing positive associations with familiar elements helped our ancestors navigate their world more safely and efficiently. The advertising industry has long exploited the mere exposure effect with tremendous success. Companies spend billions ensuring their brand names, logos, and jingles appear repeatedly in front of consumers. They understand that familiarity breeds preference, even when consumers aren't actively paying attention to the advertisements. This is why major brands maintain consistent presence across multiple platforms, from television and radio to billboards and social media. Political campaigns similarly leverage this effect. Candidates focus heavily on name recognition, understanding that voters often prefer familiar names on ballots, even when they know little about the candidate's actual positions or qualifications. Campaign signs, repeated slogans, and constant media presence all work to create familiarity and, consequently, preference. However, the mere exposure effect has important limitations. It typically requires neutral or mildly positive initial reactions. If your first experience with something is strongly negative, repeated exposure might actually intensify your dislike rather than create preference. Additionally, there's a saturation point where too much exposure leads to boredom or annoyance. That catchy song you loved after hearing it 20 times might become unbearable after hearing it 200 times. The effect also operates below our conscious awareness, which raises interesting questions about autonomy and manipulation. We like to believe our preferences reflect our authentic tastes and values, but the mere exposure effect reveals that simple repetition can shape our likes and dislikes without our knowledge or consent. Understanding this effect can help you make more conscious decisions about your preferences and choices. When you find yourself drawn to a brand, song, or idea, consider whether genuine appeal or mere familiarity is driving your preference. This awareness doesn't mean you should distrust all familiar things, but rather that you should occasionally examine whether your preferences truly serve your interests or simply reflect what you've been repeatedly exposed to. The mere exposure effect reminds us that familiarity and quality aren't the same thing, even though our brains often conflate them. The anchoring effect. Imagine you're shopping for a new jacket. The first one you see has a price tag of $500. You gasp at the cost and move on to browse other options. When you find a similar jacket priced at $200, it suddenly seems like a fantastic bargain. You buy it, feeling satisfied with your smart shopping. But here's the catch. If you'd seen the $200 jacket first, without that initial $500 reference point, you might have thought it was overpriced. That first price you encountered acted as an anchor, influencing all your subsequent judgments. This is the anchoring effect in action. The anchoring effect, also called anchoring bias, describes our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we encounter when making decisions. This initial information, the anchor, establishes a reference point that shapes our subsequent thoughts and judgments, even when the anchor is completely arbitrary or irrelevant to the decision at hand. This cognitive bias was first identified and studied extensively by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s. In one of their classic experiments, they asked participants to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Before answering, participants watched the researchers spin a wheel of fortune that randomly landed on either 10 or 65. Those who saw the wheel land on 10 gave an average estimate of 25%. Those who saw 65 gave an average estimate of 45%. A completely random number significantly influenced their estimates, even though participants knew the wheel spin was meaningless. The effect operates powerfully across numerous contexts. In retail, stores strategically use anchoring by displaying expensive items first or showing the original price crossed out next to the sale price. That was $100, now $50 label makes $50 seem reasonable, even if the item was never actually sold at the higher price. Restaurants place expensive dishes at the top of the menu, making everything else seem more affordable by comparison. Real estate agents exploit anchoring by showing buyers overpriced properties first, making subsequently shown homes appear more reasonable. Car salespeople anchor negotiations with high initial prices, knowing that even after significant reductions, buyers will feel they're getting a deal relative to that inflated starting point. The anchoring effect influences salary negotiations significantly. If an employer makes the first offer, that number becomes the anchor around which all negotiation revolves. Job candidates who receive a low initial offer often struggle to move significantly higher, even when presenting evidence of their market value. Conversely, candidates who make the first move with a high but justifiable salary request can anchor negotiations in their favor. In legal settings, anchoring affects jury decisions and settlements. Studies show that when plaintiffs request specific damage amounts, even outrageously high ones, final jury awards tend to be higher than when no specific amount is mentioned. The initial number, regardless of its reasonableness, creates a starting point that influences the final judgment. Medical diagnoses aren't immune either. When doctors receive initial information suggesting a particular condition, they sometimes anchor on that diagnosis and insufficiently adjust their thinking when contradictory evidence emerges. This can lead to misdiagnosis, despite additional information pointing toward different conclusions. The psychological mechanisms behind anchoring involve several cognitive processes. One explanation is insufficient adjustment. When presented with an anchor, we start from that point and adjust our estimate, but we typically don't adjust far enough from the initial value. Our adjustments are incremental and stop once we reach a value that seems plausible, even if further adjustment would be more accurate. Another mechanism is selective accessibility. Anchors make certain information more mentally accessible. If you're asked whether Gandhi died before or after age 140, that absurdly high number makes you think of very old ages, influencing your subsequent estimate upward, even though you know 140 is impossible. Understanding the anchoring effect can help you make better decisions. When negotiating, try to set the anchor yourself rather than responding to someone else's initial offer. When making purchases, consciously ignore irrelevant reference prices and focus on the item's actual value to you. Research market prices independently before entering negotiations. Be especially wary of anchors in high-stakes decisions. Take time to gather objective information, consider multiple perspectives, and question whether your judgments are unduly influenced by arbitrary starting points. Ask yourself, would I reach the same conclusion if I'd encountered different information first? The halo effect. You meet someone new at a party. They're attractive, well-dressed, and speak confidently. Without even realizing it, you begin assuming they're also intelligent, kind, trustworthy, and probably successful in their career. You haven't gathered any evidence for these additional qualities, yet your mind has already painted a complete picture based on a few positive first impressions. This tendency to let one positive trait color our perception of someone's other unrelated characteristics is called the halo effect. The halo effect describes how our overall impression of a person, brand, or thing influences how we feel and think about their specific traits. When we notice one standout positive quality, we unconsciously assume other positive qualities must also be present, creating a metaphorical halo that brightens our entire perception. Psychologist Edward Thorndike first identified this phenomenon in 1920 while studying how military officers rated their subordinates. He discovered that officers who rated a soldier highly on one quality, such as physical appearance or neatness, also tended to rate that same soldier highly on completely unrelated qualities like intelligence, leadership ability, and loyalty. The ratings were far more correlated than they should have been if officers were evaluating each trait independently. Physical attractiveness is perhaps the most powerful halo trait. Research consistently shows that attractive people are perceived as more intelligent, competent, trustworthy, and likable than their less attractive counterparts, even when there's no logical connection between appearance and these qualities. This beauty bias affects everything from job interviews and salary negotiations to jury verdicts and election outcomes. Attractive defendants receive lighter sentences, attractive job candidates get more offers, and attractive politicians win more votes. The effect extends powerfully into the business world. Companies with strong reputations benefit from halos that make consumers view their new products more favorably. Apple's reputation for innovative design creates a halo that makes people assume new Apple products. You pick up your daily horoscope and read, "You have a great need for other people to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. You have a great deal of unused capacity, which you have not turned to your advantage. While you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them. You pride yourself as an independent thinker and do not accept others' statements without satisfactory proof." As you read these words, you nod along thinking, "Wow, that's exactly me. This is so accurate." But here's the fascinating truth. These statements are so vague and general that they could apply to almost anyone. This tendency to believe that generic personality descriptions are specifically tailored to us is called the Barnum effect. The Barnum effect, also known as the Forer effect, describes our tendency to accept vague, general personality descriptions as uniquely applicable to ourselves. We see these broad statements as remarkably accurate personal assessments, even though they're written to apply to virtually everyone. The effect is named after P.T. Barnum, the famous showman, who reportedly said, "We've got something for everyone," though the psychological research behind it came much later. The phenomenon was first scientifically demonstrated by psychologist Bertram Forer in 1948. In a now classic experiment, Forer gave his students a personality test and promised to provide each of them with a unique personality analysis based on their results. A week later, he handed out the individual assessments and asked students to rate how accurately the analysis described them on a scale from 0 to 10-5, with 5 being perfect accuracy. The students were amazed by how well the descriptions captured their personalities, rating the accuracy at an average of 4.26 out of 5. They marveled at the test's insight into their character. But here's the twist. Every single student received exactly the same personality description. Forer had simply compiled a list of statements from newspaper horoscopes, ensuring they were vague enough to apply broadly while feeling personally meaningful. The Barnum effect works because of several psychological factors operating together. First, Humans have a strong desire to understand themselves and to be understood by others. When someone appears to see us clearly, it feels validating and meaningful. We're predisposed to accept information that helps us make sense of our own personalities and behaviors. Confirmation bias plays a crucial role as well. When reading a personality description, we naturally focus on the parts that seem to fit while ignoring or downplaying the parts that don't match. We remember the hits and forget the misses, creating an illusion of accuracy that doesn't actually exist. Our minds are excellent at finding ways to make vague statements apply to our specific experiences. The statements used in Barnum effect descriptions follow predictable patterns. They often include both sides of contradictory traits, such as, you can be extroverted and sociable, but sometimes you need time alone. This covers all possibilities, since everyone experiences both of these states at different times. The descriptions frequently mention common human desires and insecurities that most people share, like wanting to be liked or having untapped potential. Positive statements are central to the effect's success. The Barnum effect works much more powerfully with flattering descriptions than with negative ones. We're much more likely to accept general statements that paint us in a favorable light, which is why astrology readings, psychic predictions, and personality assessments typically emphasize strengths while gently mentioning challenges or areas for growth. The multi-billion-dollar industries of astrology, fortune-telling, and certain personality assessments rely heavily on the Barnum effect. Horoscopes are written with deliberately vague language that readers can interpret to fit their current circumstances. Psychics often use cold reading techniques combined with Barnum statements to convince clients they possess genuine supernatural insight. Even some legitimate-seeming personality tests exploit this effect by combining valid psychological concepts with vague, flattering generalizations. Social media has amplified the Barnum effect tremendously. Online personality quizzes constantly go viral because people love sharing results that seem to capture something unique about them, not realizing that thousands of other people received similar or identical results. These quizzes are designed to make everyone feel special and understood, which encourages sharing and increases engagement. Understanding the Barnum effect doesn't mean all personality assessments are worthless. Validated psychological instruments like the Big Five personality test make specific, falsifiable predictions and have been refined through rigorous research. The difference lies in specificity and scientific validation. Legitimate assessments provide detailed, differentiated results rather than vague statements everyone would accept. To protect yourself from the Barnum effect, develop critical thinking habits. When reading personality descriptions, ask yourself, could this statement apply to most people? Am I ignoring parts that don't fit? Is there any way to prove this statement wrong? Would I find this as accurate if I knew it wasn't specifically written for me? These questions help you distinguish between genuine insights and clever generalizations. The Barnum effect reveals something profound about human psychology. Our deep desire to be seen and understood can sometimes override our skepticism, making us believe in descriptions that tell us what we want to hear about ourselves. The paradox of choice. You walk into a grocery store looking for jam. The shelf stretches before you, displaying 47 different varieties: strawberry, raspberry, blueberry, mixed berry, organic, sugar-free, imported, local, chunky, smooth. Each option seems appealing, but you can't decide which one to choose. After 10 minutes of deliberation, you feel overwhelmed and frustrated. You leave the store without buying anything, thinking you'll come back when you have more time to decide. This counterintuitive situation, where having more options actually makes decision-making harder and less satisfying, is called the paradox of choice. The paradox of choice describes how an abundance of options, rather than making us happier and more satisfied, can actually lead to anxiety, paralysis, and dissatisfaction. We assume that more choices equal more freedom and better outcomes, but psychological research reveals a more complicated reality. Beyond a certain point, additional options become burdensome rather than liberating. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this concept in his influential book, The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. One of the most famous studies demonstrating this effect was conducted by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper in 2000. They set up a tasting booth at an upscale grocery store, displaying either 6 or 24 varieties of gourmet jam for customers to sample. The results were striking. When 24 jams were displayed, 60% of shoppers stopped to look, but only 3% actually purchased jam. When only 6 varieties were available, 40% stopped to browse, but 30% made a purchase. More choices attracted more initial interest, but resulted in far fewer actual decisions. The abundance of options created decision paralysis. Several psychological mechanisms explain why excessive choice becomes problematic. First, there's the issue of opportunity cost. Every choice means rejecting alternatives, and when there are many alternatives, the cumulative weight of what we're giving up can feel overwhelming. Choosing one jam means not choosing 46 others, each with their own potential benefits we'll never experience. Analysis. Paralysis sets in when we face too many options. Our cognitive resources become strained as we try to evaluate and compare numerous alternatives. The mental effort required to make a good decision increases with each additional option, eventually reaching a point where the task feels exhausting rather than exciting. We may postpone the decision indefinitely or avoid it altogether. The problem of escalated expectations also plays a crucial role. When presented with many options, we expect to find something perfect that meets all our criteria. Our standards rise proportionally with the number of choices available. This means that even when we finally select something good, we often feel disappointed because our expectations were unrealistically high. Regret and second-guessing intensify with more options. After making a choice from a limited set, we might occasionally wonder if we made the right decision. But after choosing from dozens or hundreds of alternatives, the nagging question, "Did I choose correctly?" becomes much more persistent. We imagine all the potentially better options we rejected, creating dissatisfaction even with objectively good choices. Modern consumer culture has amplified this paradox dramatically. Shopping for everything from breakfast cereal to streaming entertainment to romantic partners now involves navigating overwhelming arrays of options. Online shopping particularly exemplifies this problem, with virtually unlimited choices available at our fingertips. Dating apps present thousands of potential partners, making commitment difficult because there's always another profile to swipe through. The paradox of choice doesn't mean that having options is bad. Research suggests there's an optimal level of choice, typically somewhere between 2 to 6 options, depending on the decision's complexity. This sweet spot provides enough variety to feel empowered without overwhelming our decision-making capabilities. Understanding this paradox can help you navigate modern life more effectively. When facing decisions, consider limiting your options deliberately. Instead of researching every possible product, set criteria and examine only options that meet them. Give yourself time limits for decisions to prevent endless analysis. Accept that perfect choices rarely exist, and good enough is often genuinely sufficient. Embrace what Schwartz calls satisficing rather than maximizing. Satisficers set reasonable standards and choose the first option that meets them, while maximizers exhaustively search for the absolute best choice. Research shows satisficers generally experience greater happiness and less regret, even though maximizers might occasionally make marginally better choices. In a world of endless options, the ability to limit your choices and commit to decisions without excessive second-guessing becomes a valuable skill. Sometimes, less truly is more, and the freedom that matters most is the freedom from being paralyzed by possibilities. The peak end rule. Imagine 2 different visits to the dentist. During visit A, you experience moderate pain for 20 minutes. During visit B, you experience that same moderate pain for 20 minutes, followed by an additional 10 minutes of mild discomfort. Logically, visit B should be worse because it involves more total pain and lasts longer. Yet when researchers studied patients in this exact scenario, most people rated visit B as less unpleasant and were more willing to return to that dentist. This counterintuitive finding reveals a fascinating quirk of human memory called the peak end rule. The peak end rule describes how we remember experiences based almost entirely on 2 specific moments: the most intense point, whether positive or negative, and the final moments. The duration of the experience and everything that happened in between matters surprisingly little to our overall memory and evaluation. Essentially, our brains take a mental snapshot at the peak and the end, then use those 2 data points to summarize the entire experience. This phenomenon was discovered and extensively studied by psychologist Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues in the 1990s. In one famous experiment, participants submerged their hands in painfully cold water under 2 different conditions. In the first trial, they kept their hand in 14-degree water for 60 seconds. In the second trial, they kept their hand in 14-degree water for 60 seconds. Then the water was gradually warmed to a slightly less painful 15 degrees for an additional 30 seconds. When asked which trial they'd prefer to repeat, most participants chose the longer trial, even though it involved more total pain. The slightly less painful ending overshadowed the additional discomfort. Their memories favored the experience with the better ending, completely ignoring the fact that it was objectively worse because it lasted longer. The peak end rule has profound implications for how we evaluate our lives. A vacation might involve days of relaxation and enjoyment, but if it ends with a missed flight and hours stuck in an airport, that negative ending can taint your entire memory of the trip. Conversely, a challenging work project might be stressful throughout, but if it concludes with recognition and celebration, you'll likely remember it fondly. This effect influences our decisions about future experiences. If a restaurant meal ends with an exceptional dessert, you'll remember the entire dinner positively and want to return, even if the appetizers and main course were mediocre. If a movie has a disappointing ending, you'll rate the whole film poorly, regardless of how much you enjoyed the first 2 hours. Healthcare providers have learned to leverage the peak end rule to improve patient experiences. Colonoscopies, for instance, are often extended slightly, with the scope left in place, but stationary at the end. This adds a few minutes of mild discomfort, rather than ending with the more intense discomfort of scope removal. Patients who experience this extended procedure report it as less unpleasant overall and are more likely to return for future screenings. The better ending changes their memory of the entire procedure. Customer service industries increasingly apply this principle. Hotels focus heavily on checkout experiences, knowing that final interactions disproportionately affect overall satisfaction ratings. Theme parks often place memorable attractions near exits. Massage therapists might spend extra time on particularly pleasant techniques at the end of sessions. Understanding the peak end rule can help you make better decisions and design better experiences. When planning events, pay special attention to endings. A party that fizzles out will be remembered less fondly than one that ends on a high note, even if most of the party was better. When going through difficult experiences, knowing they'll end well can help you persevere through challenging middle sections. This rule also explains why we sometimes make irrational decisions about repeating experiences. We might return to a restaurant that gave us food poisoning because the incident happened early in our relationship with the place, and recent visits ended well. We might avoid beneficial medical procedures because previous ones had painful endings, even though the overall experience wasn't that bad. The peak end rule reminds us that human memory is not a video recording, but a selective storytelling process, and the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences matter more than the experiences themselves. The Pygmalion effect. A teacher receives a list at the beginning of the school year, identifying certain students as intellectual bloomers, who are expected to show remarkable academic growth. Throughout the year, the teacher unconsciously gives these students more attention, encouragement, and opportunities to excel. By year's end, these identified students have indeed shown significantly greater improvement than their classmates. Here's the remarkable twist. The students were actually selected completely at random. The teacher's expectations alone caused the improvement. This powerful phenomenon, where higher expectations lead to improved performance, is called the Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect, also known as the Rosenthal effect, describes how one person's expectations about another person can actually influence that person's behavior and performance. When we believe someone is capable of achieving something, our belief subtly shapes how we interact with them, which in turn influences their actual outcomes. Essentially, expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies. The effect is named after the Greek myth of Pygmalion, a sculptor who carved a statue of a woman so beautiful that he fell in love with it. His deep belief and desire brought the statue to life. In psychology, the term was popularized by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson through their groundbreaking 1968 study in an elementary school, which demonstrated how teacher expectations dramatically affected student performance. In their famous experiment, Rosenthal and Jacobson told teachers that certain students had been identified through testing as likely to experience significant intellectual growth during the school year. In reality, These students were chosen randomly and were no different from their peers. Yet when the researchers returned at the end of the year, the randomly selected students had gained significantly more IQ points than the control group. The teachers' elevated expectations had somehow translated into measurable academic gains. The mechanism behind this effect involves subtle behavioral changes that occur outside conscious awareness. When we hold high expectations for someone, we unconsciously communicate those expectations through various channels. We make more eye contact, speak in warmer tones, smile more frequently, and display more positive body language. We provide more detailed feedback, ask more challenging questions, and give people more time to respond before jumping in with answers. These subtle cues create a supportive environment that encourages better performance. People who sense they're expected to succeed often develop greater confidence and motivation. They're more willing to take risks, persist through challenges, and invest effort in improvement. The positive attention and opportunities they receive further accelerate their development, creating an upward spiral of achievement. The Pygmalion effect operates powerfully in workplace settings. Managers who believe in their employees' potential tend to delegate more interesting projects, provide better mentorship, and create more growth opportunities. Employees who feel their managers have confidence in them typically respond with increased engagement, creativity, and productivity. Studies have shown that teams with high expectation leaders consistently outperform similar teams with leaders who hold lower expectations. In parenting, the effect shapes children's development profoundly. Parents who genuinely believe their children are capable and intelligent raise kids who develop stronger self-esteem and achieve more academically. This doesn't mean offering empty praise or unrealistic expectations, but rather communicating authentic belief in a child's ability to learn, grow, and overcome challenges. Sports psychology recognizes the Pygmalion effect's influence on athletic performance. Coaches who expect excellence from their athletes, communicated through challenging training and genuine belief in their capabilities, often see superior results compared to coaches with lower expectations. However, the effect has a darker counterpart called the golem effect, where low expectations lead to poor performance. When teachers, managers, or parents harbor low expectations, they unconsciously communicate those beliefs through less attention, fewer opportunities, and subtle dismissiveness. People internalize these low expectations and perform accordingly, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. Understanding the Pygmalion effect carries important implications. Be mindful of the expectations you hold for others and yourself. Recognize that your beliefs about people's potential genuinely influence their outcomes. When working with others, communicate authentic confidence in their abilities while providing appropriate support and challenges. For yourself, surround yourself with people who hold high expectations for you. Seek mentors and communities that believe in your potential and challenge you to grow. The expectations of those around you shape your trajectory more than you might realize.
The decoy effect.
You're at a movie theater deciding on popcorn. A small costs $3 and a large costs $7. You're leaning toward the small because $7 seems excessive. Then you notice a medium option priced at $6.50. Suddenly, the large for only 50 cents more seems like an incredible deal. You buy the large, spending more than double what you initially intended. You've just been influenced by the decoy effect, a clever pricing strategy that manipulates your perception of value by introducing a strategically inferior option. The decoy effect, also called the asymmetric dominance effect, occurs when your preference between two options changes after a third, strategically designed option is introduced. This third option, the decoy, is deliberately priced or featured to make one of the original options appear more attractive. The decoy isn't meant to be chosen. It exists solely to influence your decision between the other alternatives. The effect was first documented by marketing professor Joel Huber and his colleagues in 1982. Their research demonstrated that consumers' choices could be predictably altered by introducing options that nobody actually wanted. This discovery revolutionized understanding of consumer decision-making and revealed that our preferences aren't as stable or rational as we'd like to believe. The mechanism works through a principle called dominance. The target option, the one companies want you to choose, clearly dominates the decoy by being better in every way or better in one dimension while being equal in others. Your brain loves finding obviously superior deals, and the presence of the dominated decoy makes the target option feel like a smart, rational choice. Consider a classic example from magazine subscriptions. The Economist famously offered three options: online only for $59, print only for $125, and print plus online for $125. The print only option is the decoy. It's identical in price to the combined package, but offers less value. Its presence makes the print plus online package seem like an obvious bargain. When researchers removed the decoy, most people chose the cheaper online-only option. The seemingly useless middle option dramatically shifted purchasing behavior. Coffee shops employ this strategy brilliantly. They offer small, medium, and large sizes, but the medium is often only slightly cheaper than the large. The medium serves as a decoy, making the large appear to offer much better value per ounce. Most customers, believing they're making a savvy economic choice, upgrade to large even though they initially wanted something smaller. Technology companies use decoys when presenting product tiers. A basic model might cost $500, a premium model $1,000, and a middle option with only marginally better features than the basic priced at $900. The overpriced middle option makes the premium seem worth the extra $100, even though you might have been perfectly satisfied with the basic model. Restaurants strategically place expensive items on menus, not expecting many people to order them, but to make other high-priced dishes seem more reasonable by comparison. That $80 steak makes the $45 pasta suddenly appear affordable and sensible. Real estate agents sometimes show buyers overpriced or undesirable properties before showing the home they actually want to sell. The inferior options serve as decoys that make the target property seem more attractive in comparison. The decoy effect exploits our tendency toward comparative rather than absolute evaluation. We struggle to assess whether something offers good value in isolation, so we rely heavily on comparisons. Marketers exploit this by controlling what we compare things to, essentially manipulating the frame of reference through which we evaluate options. Understanding the decoy effect helps you make more independent purchasing decisions. When faced with multiple options, pause and consider whether you're being influenced by a decoy. Ask yourself, would I choose this option if the middle choice didn't exist? What do I actually need, regardless of what seems like the best deal? Evaluate options based on your genuine needs and budget, rather than relative comparisons provided by sellers. That amazing deal often looks amazing only because someone carefully designed it to appear that way. The best defense against the decoy effect is awareness that your preferences can be manipulated by the mere presence of options you'd never seriously consider. The Zeigarnik effect. You're watching your favorite television series, completely absorbed in the story. The episode builds tension steadily, with the main character facing an impossible dilemma. Just as they're about to make a critical decision, the screen fades to black, and "to be continued" appears. For the next week, you can't stop thinking about what happens next. The unfinished storyline occupies your mind during work, conversations, even dreams. Meanwhile, you've completely forgotten the details of episodes you finished watching months ago. This tendency to remember incomplete or interrupted tasks better than completed ones is called the Zeigarnik effect. The Zeigarnik effect describes how our minds remain preoccupied with unfinished business. Incomplete tasks create a psychological tension that keeps them active in our memory, while completed tasks are quickly forgotten once they're done. Our brains essentially keep a mental tab open for anything unfinished, using cognitive resources to remind us that something still needs attention. This phenomenon is named after Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who discovered it in the 1920s through a curious observation. While sitting in a Vienna restaurant with her colleagues, Zeigarnik noticed that waiters had remarkable memory for unpaid orders, but couldn't recall details of orders once customers had paid. The moment a task was complete, it vanished from their working memory. Intrigued by this observation, Zeigarnik designed experiments to test the effect systematically. She gave participants a series of simple tasks like puzzles, clay modeling, and arithmetic problems. Some participants were allowed to complete their tasks, while others were interrupted before finishing. When later asked to recall the tasks they'd worked on, participants remembered interrupted tasks nearly twice as well as completed ones. The unfinished work left a stronger mental imprint. The psychological mechanism behind this effect involves what researchers call task-specific tension. When we start a task, our mind creates a kind of cognitive commitment to completing it. This creates mental tension that persists until the task is finished. Incomplete tasks generate an intrusive cognitive load, repeatedly pushing themselves back into consciousness. Completed tasks release this tension, allowing our minds to file them away and move on. The entertainment industry exploits the Zeigarnik effect masterfully. Cliffhangers at the end of television episodes or book chapters work precisely because they leave stories incomplete. The unresolved tension compels viewers to keep watching and readers to keep turning pages. Streaming platforms understand this perfectly, automatically starting the next episode before you've even decided whether to continue, capitalizing on your brain's discomfort with incompletion. Video games use this principle extensively through achievements, progress bars, and level systems. That incomplete achievement list, or partially filled progress bar, creates tension that motivates continued play. Social media platforms employ infinite scrolling, ensuring you never reach a satisfying endpoint. There's always more content, keeping you engaged far longer than you intended. In productivity and time management, the Zeigarnik effect offers valuable insights. Breaking large projects into smaller tasks and starting them, even briefly, creates mental tension that makes you more likely to return and complete them. This is why many productivity experts recommend beginning tasks immediately, even if you can't finish them right away. Starting creates momentum and mental commitment. However, the effect has downsides. Multiple unfinished tasks create accumulated cognitive load that can feel overwhelming. That growing to-do list isn't just stressful because of the work itself, but because each item represents open mental loops demanding attention. This is why completing small tasks and experiencing closure feels so satisfying and mentally refreshing. Understanding the Zeigarnik effect helps you harness its benefits while managing its drawbacks. Use it strategically by starting important tasks to create commitment but also regularly achieve closure on projects to clear mental space. When you need to stop working, try reaching natural stopping points rather than leaving things mid-sentence or mid-thought. The effect reminds us that our minds crave completion and closure. Unfinished business doesn't just sit quietly in memory. It actively demands our attention until we either complete it or consciously decide to let it go. The endowment effect. You attend a conference where organizers randomly distribute coffee mugs to half the attendees. If you received a mug, you're asked how much you'd sell it for. If you didn't receive one, you're asked how much you'd pay to buy one. Logic suggests these prices should be similar, since the mugs were distributed randomly just moments ago. Yet, consistently, mug owners demand roughly twice as much to sell as non-owners offer to buy. The moment you possess something, even briefly, you value it more highly than identical items you don't own. This is the endowment effect. The endowment effect describes our tendency to assign greater value to things simply because we own them. Once something becomes ours, we irrationally inflate its worth, demanding more to give it up than we'd be willing to pay to acquire it. Ownership creates an emotional attachment that distorts our perception of objective value. This phenomenon was first rigorously documented by behavioral economist Richard Thaler in 1980, though the classic coffee mug experiments were conducted by Daniel Kahneman, Jack Knetsch, and Thaler in the late 1980s. Their research consistently showed that ownership dramatically shifts valuation. People who owned mugs valued them at around $7, while people who didn't own them valued identical mugs at around $3. Ownership alone doubled perceived value. The psychological roots of the endowment effect lie in loss aversion, a fundamental principle of human psychology. We experience losses more intensely than equivalent gains. Losing something we own feels roughly twice as painful as the pleasure of acquiring something new. When we contemplate selling something we possess, our brain frames it as a potential loss, triggering stronger emotional responses than the prospect of gaining something equivalent. Mental ownership develops remarkably quickly. You don't need years of attachment to experience the effect. Studies show that even touching or holding an item for a few seconds can trigger a sense of ownership that increases its perceived value. This is why car dealerships encourage test drives, and stores offer generous return policies. Once you've taken something home and incorporated it into your life, even temporarily, you're far less likely to return it. Retailers exploit the endowment effect through various strategies. Free trial periods work partly because once you've used a product or service for a while, it feels like yours. Canceling feels like a loss rather than simply declining to purchase. Home staging allows potential buyers to imagine living in a space, creating psychological ownership before any transaction occurs. Online shopping uses virtual ownership to trigger the effect. Adding items to your cart creates a sense of possession. Abandoning the cart feels like giving up something that's already yours, which is why companies send reminder emails about abandoned carts. They're leveraging your reluctance to let go of items you've mentally claimed. The endowment effect explains why decluttering feels so difficult. That old jacket you haven't worn in years suddenly seems valuable when you consider donating it. The items filling your closet feel precious precisely because they're yours, even though you'd never buy most of them today at any price. This effect also influences negotiations and business decisions. Sellers consistently overvalue their assets, whether homes, businesses, or stocks, because ownership biases their perception. They remember what they paid, the effort they invested, and the personal meaning attached, all of which inflate their asking price beyond market value. Understanding the endowment effect can improve your decision-making. When evaluating whether to keep something, ask yourself, if I didn't own this, how much would I pay to acquire it today? This reframing helps you assess value more objectively by removing the ownership bias. Before making purchases, especially significant ones, recognize that you'll likely overvalue the item once it's yours, making it harder to sell or replace later. This awareness can help you make more careful acquisition decisions. The endowment effect reveals a fundamental quirk of human psychology. Possession transforms perception. The moment something becomes ours, we view it through the distorted lens of ownership, seeing value that others cannot, protecting what we have more fiercely than we pursue what we don't. The IKEA effect. The IKEA effect is a fascinating quirk of human psychology, where people place disproportionately high value on things they have built or created themselves, even when the results are objectively mediocre. The effect gets its name from the Swedish furniture company IKEA, whose business model requires customers to assemble their own furniture from flat-packed boxes. Research shows that when you build something with your own hands, you develop an emotional attachment to it that goes far beyond its actual quality or market value. You might assemble a wobbly bookshelf that took you 3 frustrating hours to put together, complete with leftover screws and slightly misaligned shelves. But to you, that bookshelf becomes more valuable than a professionally crafted piece of furniture that costs twice as much. This happens because effort creates emotional investment. When you spend time, energy, and attention building something, your brain interprets that investment as proof of the object's worth. The reasoning goes something like this: I wouldn't have invested all this effort into something worthless. Therefore, this thing must be valuable. Your brain is essentially justifying the energy you expended by increasing the perceived value of the outcome. The effect extends far beyond furniture assembly. Parents often think their children are more talented and beautiful than other children, partly because of the enormous effort invested in raising them. Entrepreneurs overvalue their business ideas because they've poured countless hours into developing them. Home cooks believe their meals taste better than restaurant food because they made it themselves. Students feel more attached to essays they wrote compared to essays they simply read. The IKEA effect can be both helpful and harmful, depending on the situation. On the positive side, it encourages engagement and ownership. When people participate in creating something, they care more about its success. This principle explains why participatory processes often generate more buy-in than top-down directives. When employees help design new workplace policies, they're more committed to following them. When customers can customize products, they become more loyal to the brand. The effect also makes tasks more rewarding. The effort you invest transforms a mundane activity into something meaningful. Building your own furniture, cooking your own meals, or growing your own vegetables becomes satisfying, not just because of the end result, but because of the process itself. The struggle becomes part of the value. However, the IKEA effect can also distort judgment and lead to poor decisions. Business owners might refuse to abandon failing ventures because they've invested so much time and effort. Investors hold on to losing positions because they personally selected those investments. People defend flawed ideas simply because they came up with them. The emotional attachment created by effort can blind you to objective quality assessments. Understanding the IKEA effect helps you recognize when your attachment to something is based on effort rather than actual value. When making important decisions about projects, relationships, or investments, ask yourself whether you're evaluating the thing itself or the effort you've put into it. Would someone with no personal investment see the same value you do? Are you continuing something because it's genuinely worthwhile or because you've already invested so much? You can also use the IKEA effect strategically. If you want people to value something more, involve them in its creation. If you want customers to feel more connected to your product, give them opportunities to customize or personalize it. If you want team members to support a decision, include them in the decision-making process. The effort they invest will increase their commitment to the outcome. The IKEA effect reveals something fundamental about human psychology. We don't value things only for their intrinsic qualities. We value them for the relationship we have with them. And nothing creates relationship faster than shared effort and creation. Mere ownership effect. The mere ownership effect describes how simply owning something makes you value it more highly than identical items you don't own. The moment an object becomes yours, your brain automatically inflates its worth, regardless of any rational basis for that increased valuation. This psychological phenomenon shapes everything from marketplace negotiations to personal attachment to ordinary possessions. Researchers have demonstrated this effect through elegant experiments. They give participants an object, perhaps a coffee mug or a chocolate bar. Then they ask how much money the participant would accept to sell it back. They also ask a control group how much they would pay to buy the same item. Consistently, owners demand significantly more money to give up the object than non-owners are willing to pay to acquire it. The mere fact of ownership, even if it lasted only minutes, increases perceived value dramatically. This happens because of a fundamental asymmetry in how your brain processes gains and losses. Losing something you own feels more painful than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. Psychologists call this loss aversion. Your brain treats giving up your mug as losing something valuable, while acquiring a new identical mug feels like a lesser gain. The pain of loss weighs more heavily than the joy of gain, making you demand more to compensate. Ownership also triggers a subtle shift in perspective. Once something belongs to you, you begin focusing on its positive qualities and minimizing its flaws. You notice the smooth handle of your mug, the pleasing color, the perfect size. When evaluating someone else's identical mug, you're more likely to notice imperfections or remain indifferent to its features. Ownership directs your attention toward aspects that justify keeping what you have. The effect strengthens over time through familiarity and routine. The longer you own something, the more your identity becomes intertwined with it. Your old jacket isn't just clothing anymore. It's part of your personal history. Your worn-out car isn't just transportation. It's filled with memories and associations. Even when these objects are objectively inferior to newer alternatives, The ownership bond makes them seem irreplaceable. This psychological tendency explains why people struggle to declutter their homes. Every item they consider discarding suddenly seems more valuable once they hold it in their hands and consider letting it go. The t-shirt they haven't worn in years becomes special the moment they think about giving it away. The book they never read becomes something they might need someday. Ownership creates attachment that obscures objective assessment. The mere ownership effect also influences economic transactions and negotiations. Sellers consistently overvalue what they're selling because they own it and must give it up. Buyers undervalue the same items because they don't yet own them and don't feel potential loss. This creates a gap between asking prices and offers that makes negotiations necessary. Both parties genuinely believe their valuation is reasonable because their perspective is shaped by their ownership status. Understanding this effect helps you make better decisions about possessions and purchases. When evaluating whether to keep something, try to imagine you don't own it yet. Would you actively choose to acquire this item today if you encountered it in a store? Would you pay money for it? This mental shift helps you see the object more objectively, without the inflated value that ownership creates. When selling something, recognize that potential buyers won't share your inflated sense of its value. They lack the ownership attachment you've developed. Price accordingly, based on market value rather than your personal emotional investment. When buying something, be aware that once you own it, you'll value it more highly and be reluctant to give it up. Make sure you genuinely want it before committing. The mere ownership effect reveals how ownership is not just a legal status, but a psychological state that fundamentally changes how you perceive value and make decisions about the objects in your life. The Ben Franklin effect. The Ben Franklin effect is a counterintuitive psychological phenomenon where doing a favor for someone actually makes you like them more, rather than the other way around. This seems backwards at first. Most people assume that we do favors for people we already like, and that receiving favors makes us like the giver more. But research consistently shows the opposite pattern. When you help someone, you become more favorably disposed toward them, even if you didn't particularly like them before. The effect gets its name from Benjamin Franklin, who discovered this principle through personal experience. Franklin wrote about a rival legislator who disliked him and opposed his initiatives. Rather than trying to win the man over through compliments or gifts, Franklin asked to borrow a rare book from the rival's library. The rival agreed and lent him the book. Franklin returned it promptly with a thank you note. After this exchange, the rival became much friendlier and more cooperative. The simple act of doing Franklin a favor transformed their relationship. This happens because of cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension you feel when your actions contradict your beliefs. When you do a favor for someone, especially someone you don't particularly like, your brain faces a conflict. Why would I help someone I don't like? That doesn't make sense. To resolve this uncomfortable inconsistency, your brain adjusts your attitude to match your behavior. You must like this person after all. Otherwise, you wouldn't have helped them. The favor becomes evidence that they're worth helping. Your brain is essentially rewriting the narrative to make your actions seem rational and consistent. It's easier to change your opinion about someone than to accept that you did something that doesn't align with your preferences. This mental adjustment happens automatically and unconsciously. You genuinely start to feel more warmly toward the person you helped. Without realizing, your brain manufactured this feeling to maintain internal consistency. The effect works particularly well because the person asking for the favor is showing vulnerability and trust. When someone asks you for help, they're implicitly saying they believe you're capable, trustworthy, and worth approaching. This flattery is subtle but powerful. Your brain registers that this person values you enough to ask for assistance. This positive signal influences your perception of them. The Ben Franklin effect has practical applications in building relationships and resolving conflicts. If you want someone to like you more, don't focus on doing favors for them or trying to impress them with your generosity. Instead, ask them to do you a small favor. Make the request modest and reasonable, something they can easily accomplish without significant cost or inconvenience. When they agree and complete the favor, their brain will adjust to like you more in order to justify their helpful action. This strategy works in professional settings, personal relationships, and even with people who seem hostile or indifferent. The key is choosing appropriate favors that are small enough not to create resentment, but meaningful enough to require some effort or consideration. Asking to borrow something, requesting advice or expertise, or seeking a small introduction are all effective approaches. The effect also explains why volunteer work and charitable giving increase people's commitment to causes. When you donate time or money to an organization, you're doing it a favor. Your brain then increases your positive feelings toward that organization to justify your continued investment. The more you give, the more you care, creating a reinforcing cycle of commitment. Understanding this effect helps you recognize when your feelings toward someone might be influenced by favors you've done for them rather than their actual qualities. If you've invested significant effort helping someone, you might be overlooking red flags or problems because your brain needs to justify that investment. The Ben Franklin effect reveals something profound about human psychology. We don't just act based on our feelings. Our feelings change based on our actions. And sometimes, the most effective way to change how someone feels about you is to let them help you. The Vividness effect. The Vividness effect describes how concrete, emotionally interesting, and image-provoking information has disproportionate influence on your thinking and decision-making compared to abstract statistical data, even when the statistics are more reliable and informative. Your brain pays more attention to vivid stories and dramatic examples than to dry numbers and probabilities. This creates systematic distortions in how you assess risk, make judgments, and form beliefs about the world. Imagine reading a news story about a single shark attack with graphic details, witness quotes, and photos of the victim. Then imagine reading a statistical report showing that coconuts falling from trees kill more people annually than sharks. Despite the statistics being more informative about actual risk, the vivid shark attack story will have far greater impact on your fear and behavior. You'll worry about sharks at the beach while completely ignoring the coconut trees above your head. This happens because of how your brain processes and stores information. Vivid information creates strong mental images that are easy to recall later. When you need to make a judgment or decision, your brain pulls from available memories. The dramatic shark attack comes to mind immediately because it made such a strong impression. The abstract statistics about coconut deaths never formed memorable mental images, so they remain inaccessible when you're actually assessing danger. Emotional content amplifies the vividness effect dramatically. Stories that trigger fear, anger, sadness, or excitement embed themselves more deeply in memory than neutral information. Evolution shaped your brain to pay special attention to emotionally charged information because it often signaled important threats or opportunities. A vivid story about someone who died from a rare disease feels more relevant and probable than statistics showing millions of people who lived healthy lives. The news media exploits the vividness effect constantly. A single dramatic crime story receives extensive coverage with interviews, photos, and emotional details. Meanwhile, the statistical reality that crime rates are declining gets minimal attention because it's abstract and lacks emotional punch. This creates widespread misperceptions about safety and risk. People become terrified of statistically unlikely dangers while ignoring genuine risks that lack dramatic examples. Personal anecdotes carry enormous weight because of their vividness. When your friend tells you about a terrible experience with a particular car brand, complete with frustrating details and emotional reactions, that single story will influence your buying decision more than consumer reports analyzing thousands of vehicles. One person's vivid experience overwhelms statistical reliability data that should be far more informative. The vividness effect distorts medical decisions regularly. People hear a dramatic story about someone who had a bad reaction to a vaccine and become terrified of vaccination. They ignore statistics showing millions of safe vaccinations and focus entirely on the one vivid negative example. The dramatic story is concrete and emotionally engaging, while the statistics feel abstract and impersonal. Understanding the vividness effect helps you recognize when your judgments are being swayed by memorable examples rather than reliable data. When making important decisions about risk, safety, investments, or purchases, actively seek out statistical information and base rates. Ask yourself how many cases exist overall, not just how dramatic the most memorable examples are. Force yourself to think about the invisible majority. For every vivid story about something going wrong, there are usually thousands or millions of unremarkable cases where nothing noteworthy happened. These boring cases don't make the news and don't create memorable stories, but they're far more representative of actual probability. Be especially cautious when vivid information aligns with your existing fears or beliefs. Your brain will grab on to confirming examples and treat them as more important than they actually are. A person who already fears air travel will remember every plane crash story vividly while forgetting about millions of safe flights. Someone who distrusts technology will remember every story about privacy breaches while ignoring statistics about improved security. You can also use the vividness effect strategically when you need to persuade or teach. Abstract concepts become more impactful when illustrated with concrete, vivid examples. Statistics become more meaningful when paired with individual stories that make the numbers feel real. Just be ethical about this power. Use vivid examples that accurately represent the broader reality rather than cherry-picking dramatic outliers that distort understanding. The vividness effect reveals how your brain prioritizes memorable, emotional, concrete information over abstract truth. Recognizing this tendency helps you think more clearly and make better decisions based on actual evidence rather than whatever dramatic story happens to stick in your memory. The flow state. The flow state is a mental condition where you become completely absorbed in an activity, losing track of time, self-consciousness, and external distractions. During flow, your skills perfectly match the challenge you're facing, creating an experience of effortless concentration and peak performance. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi named and studied this phenomenon extensively, finding it across cultures, activities, and skill levels. When you're in flow, several distinct characteristics emerge simultaneously. Time distorts, usually passing much faster than normal. Hours feel like minutes because you're not monitoring the clock or thinking about duration. Your sense of self temporarily dissolves. The inner critic that usually commentates on your performance goes silent. You stop worrying about how you look or whether you're good enough. Action and awareness merge into a seamless experience where you respond intuitively without deliberate thought. The activity itself becomes intrinsically rewarding during flow. You're not doing it for external rewards or future benefits. The process itself provides complete satisfaction. A musician in flow isn't thinking about applause or recording contracts. A programmer in flow isn't focused on salary or deadlines. A rock climber in flow isn't concerned with reaching the summit. The immediate experience is its own reward. Flow requires a precise balance between challenge and skill. If the task is too easy relative to your abilities, you become bored. Your mind wanders because you're not sufficiently engaged. If the task is too difficult, you become anxious and frustrated. You focus on your inadequacy rather than the activity itself. Flow emerges in the narrow zone where the challenge slightly stretches your current capabilities without overwhelming them. Clear goals and immediate feedback are essential conditions for flow. You need to know what you're trying to accomplish and whether your actions are moving you toward that goal. This feedback loop keeps you engaged and allows for constant micro-adjustments. Athletes get instant feedback through physical sensations and results. Artists get feedback through seeing their work take shape. Gamers get feedback through scores and progress indicators. The neurochemistry of flow involves several brain changes that enhance performance and satisfaction. Your prefrontal cortex, which handles self-monitoring and conscious deliberation, temporarily deactivates. This explains why self-consciousness disappears and actions feel automatic. Your brain releases dopamine, norepinephrine, and other neurochemicals that sharpen focus and boost motivation. This cocktail of brain chemistry creates feelings of energized concentration and mild euphoria. Flow states improve both performance and well-being. During flow, you often achieve your best work because you're fully engaged without internal interference. The inner critic is quiet. Doubt and hesitation vanish. You access your full capabilities without mental friction. People who regularly experience flow report higher life satisfaction and sense of meaning. These periods of complete absorption provide some of life's most satisfying moments. You can deliberately create conditions that increase flow likelihood. Choose activities where your skill level matches the challenge appropriately. Set clear goals for each session. Minimize external distractions that might interrupt your concentration. Protect blocks of time when you can work without interruption. Start with warm-up activities that ease you into deeper focus gradually. Different activities facilitate flow more easily than others. Sports, music, art, coding, writing, and crafting are common flow activities because they provide clear goals, immediate feedback, and scalable challenge levels. However, almost any activity can produce flow if structured properly. Even routine work can become absorbing when you set specific challenges and focus completely on execution. The relationship between flow and happiness is complex. Flow itself is not always pleasant in the moment. It requires intense concentration and effort. But retrospectively, people identify flow experiences as some of their most satisfying and meaningful life moments. The struggle itself becomes worthwhile because you were fully alive and engaged. Understanding flow helps you design your life around activities and conditions that produce this state more frequently. Rather than seeking passive pleasure or distraction, you can pursue engaging challenges that demand your full attention and capabilities. These experiences provide deeper satisfaction than entertainment or leisure ever could. The flow state reveals something essential about human fulfillment. We're happiest not when things are easy, but when we're fully absorbed in meaningful challenges that stretch our abilities just beyond our comfort zone.